Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm TX141, but you may call me Paul. Welcome you all to a brand new Ace in the Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the Lavochkin La-7B-20, a Russian fighter aircraft coming at a tier of 4 and a battle rating of 5.0. Having already provided a historical overview to the La-7 fighter in general, as may be seen using the link in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now, let us divulge into the history behind the B-20 subvariant. We begin by realising that this was an unofficial subvariant of the La-7 and was named thus due to the switching out of the two 20mm Shvat cannons in the original for three Berezin B-20 cannons. With 130 rounds per gun, these cannons were located in the engine cowling, with two cannons on the port side and one to starboard, as seen from the pilot's perspective. The three Berezin cannon setup was preferable for the La-7, as the B-20 cannon was a 1944 design based off of a conversion of Berezin's 12.7mm UB machine gun, which was very popular among the Yakovlev Yak series fighters. The B-20 cannon fired approximately 800 rounds per minute, at a velocity of 760 meters per second. This was very similar to the Shvat's 750 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 770 meters per second. In essence, the B-20 was the same gun with a higher rate of fire. But what's more, the empty mass of a single B-20 cannon was 25 kilograms. This was almost half the mass of the 40 kilogram Shvat cannon, making it a welcome replacement and allowing for a third cannon to be installed for the La-7. In June of 1944 then, tests were initiated for the La-7B-20 subvariant, yet the weapon had not been fully tested at this point, i.e. the B-20 cannon, and was prone to jamming. By the close of 1944, these issues had been rectified, with 2,275 B-20 cannons produced, meaning that at the start of January 1945, production of the La-7 began to transition to the B-20 armed version, with 74 fighters available for combat service by the end of the month. At least 368 La-7B-20s have been produced by the end of the La-7's production life in the autumn of 1945. The net effect of adding the additional armament was a net mass gain of 65 kilograms for the fighter, slightly decreasing its overall climb rate, but making it a more effective fighter in the low to medium altitude domain in which it was originally designed for. And so with our historical overview out of the way, let us take a look at how the La-7B-20 handles in War Thunder. For today's gameplay, we're on the Airfield Domination map Corson using the following setup. Ground target belts are our 20mm cannons, the reasoning being as follows. Firstly, these belts comprise 3/4 of high explosive fragmentation incendiary or high explosive fragmentation rounds, which are very effective when dealing with enemy fighters, usually only requiring a 1 to 2 second burst. On top of this, we may sustain these bursts when going up against the more heavily armed and armoured bombers such as B-17s and Yer-2s, although this will cut into our limited ammunition supply of 390 rounds in total, spread equally across our cannons. To offset this, we have a fourth round, the armour-piercing incendiary tracer round. The armour-piercing incendiary component is very good in particular at being able to penetrate enemy fuel tanks and ignite them, allowing us to cause our opponents to burn to death, especially say a B-17. We also have the tracer, which enables us to see where our rounds are going, and if we happen to miss our opponent, we can try and correct rather quickly using this tracer, and then bring our opponent down without wasting too much more ammunition. For our gun convergence, we are using a 500 meter gun convergence as per the norm for guns localised to the nose. And for our fuel capacity, we are using the normal 30-minute fuel load to ensure that we can make it to the end of the game unscathed in terms of fuel. We initiate this review then by taking a look at the climb rate of the La-7B-20 and some of the key weaknesses of this plane straight from the start. We can see that our war emergency power is greyed out. This occurred at approximately 2,800 meters altitude and will vary plus or minus 200 meters depending on the game you are in, i.e. which map. When the WEP greys out, the effectiveness is not completely lost. It depreciates to approximately 50%, and this is most likely to replicate the limited high altitude performance nature of the Shvetsov engine in the La-7. As a result, your climb rate begins to weaken once you hit approximately 3,000 meters altitude, making the climb rate slightly above average for the battle rating and tier composition, but not able to match up to the likes of the Focke-Wulf 90 D9, or say the Griffon Spitfires, or the Merlin Spitfires, the later ones, such as the Spitfire Mark 16, the Spitfire LF Mark 9, or the Spitfire Mark 14E. You will also find yourself struggling when trying to climb with planes such as the Ki-84, and even perhaps the J2M3, although these are more comparable climb rates. However, you can offset this by taking a less direct approach, as we have depicted here, by reversing our climb direction at approximately 3,200 metres altitude and then coming back around once we're up at an altitude of 3,800 metres or so. And once you have levelled out, you'll find that this plane builds up its speed really nicely and that the straight line acceleration is exceptional in all but a couple of cases when going up against, say, the Focke-Wulf 90 D9. You do not need to continuously apply war emergency power to build up your speed. The plane will do it for you from a speed range of 250 all the way up to 550 km an hour, as we can see here with our acceleration beginning to wane off at 550 km an hour, that is. This means we are prepared to dive down and initiate our first boom and zoom pass. We pick on a P-39Q Aerocobra in particular for our first kill, getting in close before opening fire, but more on that later after this pass. We now replicate this by targeting a Spitfire F Mark 9, who is completely oblivious to our presence, as they try to pursue some of our friendly fighters just over the airfield. Again, we get in close. Notice that our roll rate is beginning to lock up slightly, as we are in excess of 650 km an hour when the roll rate lock-off kicks in, and we push through to take down a Dornier 217E, or at least attempt to, for our third kill. Here we see that we open fire a longer distance, and we start to miss, not judging the correct lead, and as a result we start to compensate for this as we get in closer, but also provide a little bit more lead to knock out the Dornier's pilot and pick up our third kill for that pass. Now we have covered a number of points in that single pass and we should elaborate on them. Firstly, the roll rate lockup. At 650 km an hour, the roll rate of this plane, which is very good for its battle rating and tier, coming second to the Focke-Wulf 90 A series fighters and lying just in front of the Messerschmitt 19G series fighters. The roll rate begins to lock up and depreciate all the way into 750 km an hour, when it drops to approximately 50% of its standard nature at a speed of 400 km an hour, let's say. And as a result, this means that the precision of targeting planes in those high-speed boom and zoom passes begins to fade away, which means you have to take a more gradual approach and not make as violent manoeuvres. But in a way, this is also replicated by the lockup of the elevator control, which begins to lock up again at 600 km an hour or so. And this lockup is really felt by the time you hit 750 km an hour, meaning that two of your control surfaces are compromised at this speed, i.e. the elevator and the ailerons. The only control surface not affected is the rudder, and this is the most powerful control surface if you eliminate the other two at these speeds. However, as you drop down to a decent speed for this aircraft of say 350 through to 450 km an hour, the roll rate is the primary control surface backed up with the rudder, and then the elevator is its tertiary. This means that the plane is not as manoeuvrable as a turn fighter per se, but instead it is a plane which relies on its roll rate to initiate manoeuvres such as rolling scissors to cause its opponents to overshoot into its guns. And this is a very good way, when you're flying an La-7B-20, of dealing with a Yakovlev Yak-9P which may be on your tail. You cannot outmanoeuvre it in terms of turn circle, especially as you go to lower speeds. Your turn circles become akin to one another at lower speeds, like when you go below 300 km an hour. But you can use your superior roll rate to force the overshoot via rolling scissors manoeuvres. Having levelled out once again, we can see how we are taking the indirect approach of heading round the flanks of the map in order to set up our next boom and zoom pass. We are taking a very slow approach, and this is what the La-7B-20 rewards, simply because this plane does not have the ability to push above say 5,000 metres altitude from the outset as rapidly as most of its battle rating contemporaries, but instead it requires you to be methodical. In turn, whilst not represented here, this plane can act as a good bomber hunter up at higher altitudes, although you will not be the primary fighter to do so. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt 19G6 will get there before you. You should act as a secondary line of defence, much like when we saw with the Focke-Wulf 90 F8 when we reviewed that quite a while back. You'll be the second line and the final stand. But carrying through onto our second boom and zoom pass here, we pick on another Spitfire, this time a Spitfire Mark 5C, who again seems oblivious to our presence, and our initial shots were going behind the enemy aircraft, so we had to compensate by getting in closer. And we should point out here that when we get in close, it means that we are more accurate with our shots without having to provide additional lead onto the lead indicator. This is because of the lower muzzle velocity of the B-20 cannon by comparison with the other cannons provided by other nations at the battle rating and tier. In particular, the Hispano cannon for the British, alternatively the Mauser MG151 20mm cannon for the Germans. These cannons have slightly higher muzzle velocities and are easier to compensate for, by comparison with the B-20 here, which essentially has the same projectile path as the 20mm Shavak. And we've already seen on a number of occasions how the 20mm Shavak's lower muzzle velocity means that unless you provide ample lead from the outset, you're going to waste a lot of ammunition until you get within a decent range. Which is why we're trying to avoid opening fire in excess of 500 metres distance here, with a good range for the 20mm cannon being approximately 400 to 300 metres, and that is where you can aim just slightly in front of the provided lead indicator to get the kill rather quickly. But then again, we do have the tracer if we happen to miss. We now set up our third boom and zoom pass, picking on an enemy Typhoon. We go full into this dive, and we are going to see how once again we are avoiding any exaggerated manoeuvres. Unfortunately, we do not score any decent hits on the Typhoon, only knocking out their central gear leg, but we carry through onto the P-51 here, striking their fuel tank either with the high explosive fragmentation incendiary or the armour piercing incendiary tracer round. That P-51 is now going to burn to death, and we carry our momentum through to strike a Messerschmitt 19 F4 a couple of times, but achieving no significant damage. The P-51 has now been knocked out and we have picked up our ace. We also fire a couple of rounds into a burning P-51 in front of us just to try and pick up the assist on their pilot, a means of getting a little bit more research points over the course of a game. As we carry our momentum through once again, we should now move on to the energy conservation of this plane. In the midst of a turn, the plane holds its energy rather well, although it does bleed it through exaggerated manoeuvres. When you're performing rolling scissors, for example, you will bleed your speed rather rapidly. And as long as you do not perform any exaggerated manoeuvres in a boom and zoom pass, you will usually find yourself being able to exit a boom and zoom strategy with a speed of approximately 550 to 650 km an hour, providing you the ability to get some distance on your opponents before they can keep up. Only planes such as the P-47D-25 or 28 Thunderbolt will be able to keep up with you in a dive, or the Focke 190D9, and these are the exceptions, not the norm. As we level out once again, we are at a lower altitude this time, as we are trying to pressure some of the planes which are gaining altitude now. We see that the I-185 dives down, but we have a Spitfire on the horizon, and that is a plane we will not feel comfortable turning with or trying to outmanoeuvre, simply because the Spitfire has the better turn circle, and at moderate speeds, i.e. not in excess of 500 km an hour, it is the better manoeuvrability based fighter by comparison with our own. Fortunately for us, most of our opposition has once again dived down, and this means that we can begin to put pressure once again and perform another boom and zoom pass. This means that so far we have reflected on the fact that so long as you do not provide violent manoeuvres during boom and zoom, you can usually make your way through the furball unscathed. Violent manoeuvres will compromise your speed, and it may mean you will pick up some hits. The wings of this plane are not that strong, nor is the tail section. This is due to the primarily wooden construction of the plane. The most durable part is based around the cockpit, and it is worth noting that the additional armour modifications, i.e. the bulletproof glass thickness and the rear armour plating, will not cause too much of a significant impact, or at least in my experience, to the flight characteristics of this plane. I am currently flying with them as seen in this game. On top of this, what we also have to consider is that most of the durability of this aircraft is based around the cockpit and engine, thanks to the additional armour plating and also the fact that the engine is rather durable. It can take a good number of hits before being knocked out, meaning that head-ons are sometimes advisable, especially if you open fire and provide a little bit of vertical lead at longer ranges. We wipe out another Spitfire for kill number 6, shred a Yak-9T for kill number 7, and we carry through here, but can see how at high speeds, i.e. in excess of 650 km an hour or around about there, we just cannot roll with our opponents, or at least match them, in very tight manoeuvres. And this means that as we knock out the Yakovlev Yak-3 to pick up a kill and pick up an assist on the Messerschmitt 19F, we've made another triple strike occur, and we are now on 8 kills, with a P-47 rather nicely levelling out alongside us, making for a brilliant screenshot. So we can see here as our opponents began to react to our presence, either through missed shots or just hearing us behind them, we could not keep with them, and this is a core weakness of the La-7 at high speeds, but we have already discussed that. We carry through then, and we begin to notice that the recommended altitude range of this aircraft is anywhere below 4,500 metres altitude, as at this altitude or below, the plane performs very well, and as you decrease the altitude of this aircraft, the performance picks up, peaking in approximately the 2,500 metre altitude range, but for the purposes of trying to provide altitude supremacy and suppress your opponents to fight down low, you want to occupy that 4,500 metre altitude ground, which this plane can climb to, not as quickly as some of its adversaries, but at a decent rate to be able to become competitive. In terms of being able to head on, as we have said, the durability of this plane is based around the engine, and if you open fire at longer distance you can bring down your opponents thanks to the rather large burst mass at a longer distance by providing ample lead. However, head-ons are not always to be recommended, and a more subtle approach will be. So as we can see here, as we eliminate the enemy bow fighter for what will be kill number 9 and our final kill for the game, By taking your time and picking up your opponents gradually, you can be very effective over the course of a game. Let us move on to the post-game stats. With our 9 kills and single assist, we're able to pick up 46,455 silver lions and 4,280 research points. In order to defeat the La-7B-20 then, you can take one of two approaches. The first is to try and lure it into a manoeuvrability based dogfight at speeds below 300 km an hour, where its manoeuvrability will pale by comparison with that of a Spitfire, a Yak-3 or a Zero. The alternative is to try and bait the B-20 to chase you up to an altitude in excess of 5,500 metres, as beyond these altitudes the plane will begin to suffer in terms of engine performance, and it will begin to stall out behind you at a speed of approximately 160 km an hour. In this instance, planes such as the P-51D Mustang, the Ka-84, or alternatively the Messerschmitt 19G will be able to outperform and force the B-20 into a position where it is a sitting duck. However, these means of defeating the La-7B-20 are akin to those we found with the base La-7 variant, and as a result, when we take this through into a comparison of how the two planes handle and their overall characteristics, they are practically identical. The only difference in what attributes that 1.0 battle rating increase to the B-20 is the change in armament. By adding one more 20mm cannon and using cannons with a slightly higher rate of fire, you find that you've got a more effective killing machine for a battle rating of 5.0. But at the same time, you also have some weaknesses attributed to this. Remember, you have 40 rounds less per cannon with the B-20, and if you happen to miss your opponent, you'll find that you're expending more ammunition, and as a result you may find yourself facing more frequent reloads, alternatively reloads of inconvenience, especially when you're on the tail of an opponent and they start to get away. But the B-20 requires the same playstyle as the base La-7, and by implementing this we came third by comparison to the rest of our team. As a result, when we look at the La-7B-20 as a plane by itself, it is a solid performer, and is able to bridge at a moderate altitude, i.e. about 4,000 metres to 3,000 metres altitude, the gap between say the Focke-Wulf 190A series and the Messerschmitt 19 F to G series. But by comparison with the La-7, you may find that this plane ends up going unnoticed, just like we did during the course of today's gameplay. And so I've been TX141. And if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. Yet until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies!